Yo, what up, Sci fam? And welcome to another Science Notebook Page video notes. Today, we're going to be learning about ecosystem dynamics. So we will define what an ecosystem is, look at predator-prey relationships, food chains, trophic levels, blah, 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 blah. A lot of things you've probably learned before, but it's always good to refresh our mind and our brain as we enter this new unit and kind of get started with things. So let's begin with ecosystem dynamics. Now, you've probably heard of this word system before. There's a lot of different systems. It means things that work together. And then you've actually probably also heard about something that's like eco-friendly or ecology or ecosystem. And this eco word is also an important prefix. And this eco means home. So when we're talking about an ecosystem, we're talking about a system of someone's home, and specifically not someone but animals and plants. So let's first start by defining ecosystem. So in biology and ecology, which is another eco word, it's the study of the homes of things. So it's basically just a biological, which means living things, because bio means life. So a community of living things, a biological community of interacting organisms. And it's not just the organisms, but it's also their physical environment. So that means like what resources are available, what type of water or plants are around, whether or not it's an ocean ecosystem or a freshwater ecosystem or a rainforest ecosystem or a desert ecosystem. The physical environment is important as well as the organisms. All right, within ecosystems, if we were to break down the animals that live there, typically we break them down into two simple categories. And the first one that we'll look at is the predators. So a predator is something that hunts other animals, and those other animals are what we're going to talk about next, and those are called prey. So predators hunt other animals for their food. So basically we could say they're meat eaters because they're eating other animals. And prey are the animals that get eaten by the predators, and prey must avoid those predators, or at least to the best of their ability. So that prey must avoid predators. And in order to avoid the predators, they are going to typically use things like camouflage, or they could use herding behavior. That's like what a lot of deer do, and elk as well. They stay in big herds so they can fight off those mountain lion predators. So prey aren't just plant eaters. Prey are just anything that could be eaten by some other animal. So they must avoid predators, and so they use camouflage, herding behavior. Some of them burrow underground like groundhogs, and others just use speed to outrun them. All right. So if we look at what a food chain is, well, we know that a food chain is what eats what, essentially. And so the first level of a food chain is going to be the producer. We call them the producer because they produce the food for the rest of the food chain. And so specifically, these are always going to be plants. And then the plants are eaten by things that we would call primary, because primary means like the first consumer. And if it's a consumer, then it's going to consume something, and it consumes the plants. So we draw the arrow in this direction because the energy from the plants moves into the consumer. So we go from producer, which let's just draw a shape around it to help us out here, producer to the primary consumer. Now to keep it simple, if you're one above the primary consumer, we'd say that now you're the secondary consumer, which means that this organism is going to consume the primary consumer. The secondary one eats the primary one. And the energy from the primary one goes into the secondary's stomach. So that's why we draw the arrow in that direction. Now, if we were actually talk about what these types of animals would be, a primary consumer is what we would call an herbivore, because they are what eat the plants. And if an herbivore gets eaten by a secondary consumer, then the secondary consumer is what we would call a carnivore, meaning that they eat meat. And a tertiary means third, so a tertiary is our next level. Tertiary. I'm actually spelling that wrong. Tertiary. There we go. Tertiary consumer is the third level of consumer here. And you could have even more consumers than this, but whenever we end our food chain, this is what we would call someone who's like the top predator. And this is going to be a carnivore as well. So this top predator is going to be the top of the food chain. Now, one thing to note is that the secondary consumer is going to typically eat other animals, but it might also be a scavenger and it might eat some plants. The tertiary consumer, the top predator, is almost always going to be, well, if they're the top predator, then they're pretty much going to only rely on meat. So they are a pure carnivore. All right, so you can see how something that's important with the food chain is we draw the arrow to show where the energy goes. So all of the energy ends up going up the food chain. And so that's why the arrows are pointed in that direction. All right, something that relates to food chains that's also important here when we look at ecosystem dynamics is something that's called trophic levels. And a trophic level is the position an organism occupies in a food chain. So essentially, the plants occupy the producer trophic level. Herbivores typically occupy the primary consumer trophic level. So each of these little different shapes that I drew demonstrates a different trophic level. Essentially what I'm trying to explain here is a trophic level is what eats it and what it eats. So essentially we'd say what eats it, the energy goes into that other organism because it gets eaten, and what it eats, the energy goes into it because it's eating something. All right, so trophic levels are basically what it eats and what eats it. An herbivore eats plants and carnivores eat it. So that's how we define trophic level. All right, let's take a look and draw a couple graphs here to show what typically happens in an ecosystem. So if we think about resources in an ecosystem, I'm going to use a star to kind of demonstrate this. So if we have time and population, time is on our x-axis and population is on our y-axis. So as time goes on, let's say that the number of resources is really high, but it starts to decline. Maybe there's like a drought, or maybe it's just this is the fall and it goes into wintertime because time is moving on. Well, how that typically then impacts the population, let's use a square to show population, is that the population cannot eat, or it cannot be bigger than the number of resources. The number of resources is going to dictate the population. If there's more resources, there's going to be more population. And if there's less resources, then we should see that the population actually would decline as the number of resources declines, because there's no longer as many resources available. So if we think about this being a wetland, and maybe a mall comes in and replaces the wetland, and so therefore there's not as many resources for birds to come in, and so the number of birds that would come in would decline. So this is how resources and population are related to each other, is that if you have more resources, it can support more population. If you have less resources, then less of a population can be supported. All right, well, let's look at the difference then in the interaction between predator and prey populations. So let's say that we have bunnies, and I'm going to use a circle here to show a bunny's population. So let's say that we start with just a few bunnies, and those bunnies start to reproduce. So we have more and more and more bunnies in our population. Well, let's show the number of coyotes then, and we'll do coyotes in a triangle. Okay, well, if there's not many bunnies here, then there can't really be very many coyotes. And as more bunnies start to be alive in the population, then we can end up having more and more coyotes. And at some point, perhaps there's too many coyotes and they end up eating more bunnies than there's available, and they end up depleting the bunny population. Another thing that could happen is maybe the food runs out for the bunnies and more houses come in, so there's less population for the bunnies. And so the bunny population starts going down. So either the resources decline or the predator might eat too many of them, and so therefore the population goes down of the bunnies. Well, how that affects the predator is that the predator's population can't keep going up. Not gonna happen because there's not enough resources available. So what happens is we end up seeing that the coyote population would also go down because we end up having not enough resources. So we end up seeing that the predator and prey populations end up being interrelated with one another. And that's why if there is a population of coyotes, they can't overpopulate and just continue to rise because the number of resources would become depleted. So instead, their population starts to go down as the number of resources go down. So in any ecosystem, there is a relationship between resources available and the populations that are available. Also, if there's predators and prey in the ecosystem, which ecosystems have, the predator and prey populations will also be related to one another. As one goes up, the other can go up, but as one goes down, the other one typically is going to go down. However, when there is less predator population here in the very bottom, that actually allows there to be more and more bunnies. So we end up having more bunny population. And then as a result, that coyote population can start to increase as well. So you can kind of see the dynamic relationships here in the predator and prey populations. All right. This is a nice intro, hopefully, and hopefully this has reminded you of what you've learned in the past, so we can now continue on as if there's lots of resources, because there is a lot of resources in this unit. Here we go.